Greetings, Internet people. You're tuned into the Keep It Real RN channel. My name is Craig, and I'll be your host. And today we're going to talk about how to survive floating to another unit. Now, why do nurses have to float? Well, the reason for that is because in a hospital, the patient's census and acuity is dynamic. And that means that in one unit, you may have a surplus of nurses relative to the number of patients and or the acuity of those patients. And in another unit, you have a deficit of nurses relative to the number of patients and or the acuity of those patients. And hospital administration has had this idea for many, many, many years that a nurse is a nurse is a nurse is a nurse, and that you should be able to take the extra nurse or nurses from the unit that has the surplus of nurses and plug them in to the unit that has the deficit of nurses and solve your staffing problem. Now, why or why not this is a good or bad idea, I encourage you to discuss down there in the comment section. So you arrive at work and you look at the assignment sheet and you see that you've been reassigned to another unit. Now, the first question that comes to your mind is, why do I have to float? Well, the reason that you have to float depends on how your unit selects float nurses. Now, most units that I've worked in selects the float nurse based on the float date. And what that means is that there's a book that contains all of the nurses' names in that unit. And when that nurse floats, a float date gets written next to the nurse's name. And so when staffing calls and tells the charge nurse of that unit that the charge nurse has to float a nurse or two, the charge nurse consults the float book and selects the nurse or nurses with the oldest float date. And those are the nurses that are going to float that day. So you look on the assignment sheet and see that you've been reassigned. Well, congratulations, you have been selected. The next thing you're going to want to know is, what type of unit are you floating to? And you're probably going to feel uncomfortable about floating to that unit. Well, there's a big difference between feeling uncomfortable and being unsafe. Now, if you're an ICU nurse who's floating to another ICU, you do possess a certain core set of competencies that will translate from one unit to another. And when you get to that other unit, you really only need to be concerned with the specificities of that unit. Same thing if you're a med-surg nurse. If you work on a medical floor and you have to go to a surgical floor, you do possess a core set of competencies that do translate to that floor. You only need to concern yourself with the specificities of that floor. Situations where you may cross over from uncomfortable to unsafe might include a med-surg nurse being told that that nurse has to float to an ICU. A med-surg nurse does not possess the core competencies to work in an ICU. Or an ICU nurse or med-surg nurse being told that that nurse has to float to pediatrics or OB or someplace like that. That's a situation where that nurse does not possess the core competencies to work in that area, and you could make the argument that it is unsafe. If you've ever been faced with a situation like that where you've been told you have to float to an area that you felt unsafe, I would like to hear about it in the comment section below. This may sound cliche, but go to your float with a positive attitude, because if you go there with a negative attitude expecting a lousy experience and a lousy assignment, the chances are good you will have a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you go there with a positive attitude, you just might end up with a good assignment. You just may have a positive experience. You might learn something new, and you just might meet a new friend. So what about expectations of you as a float nurse? What are the expectations of yourself? Chances are good you will not perform up to the same level that a nurse who regularly works on that unit does, especially when it comes to the unit-specific stuff. Now, a mentor of mine put my mind at ease about floating one time when he said, "When I float to another unit, I am a Band-Aid. I am there to make sure that the patient gets their meds on time. I am there to make sure they get their treatments done. I am there to make sure that nothing bad happens. I am not there to update the plan of care and all that other nonsense." So if the patient is no worse off at the end of my shift than they were at the beginning of my shift, it was a successful shift. So after hearing that, it's like I kind of put that practice to work. And so if the patient is no worse off at the end of your shift than they were at the beginning, you have done a good job. The first thing that you need to do when you arrive in your new unit is identify your resources. And typically the first person you meet will probably be the charge nurse, who will give you your assignment and either give you the tour or ask somebody to give you a tour. A good unit will assign you a resource nurse or a buddy. And this is the person that you can ask all the silly questions that you need to ask, like, where is this? Where is that? Who do I call for this? Who do I call for that? It is with the charge nurse or the resource nurse or buddy you have been assigned that you discuss what are the unit routines specific to that unit. Where do you find things? Who do you call for this and that? What are some of the specific things that you look for in that patient population? Is there any specific charting items that you need to be aware of? Now, personally, when I float to a unit, all I really need to know is where's the coffee, where's the bathroom, and the rest I deal with on an as-needed basis. When you're getting report from the off-going nurse, ask questions. If something is unclear, ask for clarity. Make sure you review the day's orders with the off-going nurse. Check your drips together, check the IV sites and tubings together, and do a quick check of the patient. When you start your shift, introduce yourself to your patients again. Make sure to introduce yourself to family and visitors. Introduce yourself to doctors and other interdisciplinary members. And one of the most important people to introduce yourself to is the nurse working next to you, because that is your wingman. And if you act approachable, you will most likely be approached, and people will avail themselves to you. If you're looking for something and you can't find it, spend a couple minutes looking for it, but don't hesitate to ask somebody if time is an issue. Now, the charge nurse or your resource nurse or even a random nurse from the unit may periodically come around and ask if you're okay, if you need anything. Then again, they may not, especially if you're being quiet and keeping to yourself, because a lot of people interpret a nurse being quiet and keeping to themselves as that they're just fine, when you may, in fact, be drowning. So if you truly are drowning, make sure you tell somebody, your wingman, your neighbor, your resource nurse, the charge nurse, or somebody, so that you can get some help. Now, when it comes to being asked if I'm okay, I kind of find it a little bit annoying if I get asked that a lot, because I will let you know, believe it or not, I will let you know if I need anything. I am not hesitant to do that. Remember that when you're floating, safety comes first, and that starts with identifying your resources. And it continues with getting a good bedside report from the off-going nurse, asking questions, getting clarity on things that are unclear to you, reviewing the day's orders with the off-going nurse, checking the IVs, the drips, the IV sites, doing a quick bedside check with the off-going nurse. Reintroduce yourself to the patient. Introduce yourself to family and visitors. Introduce yourself to the doctors or multidisciplinary people that come in to see your patient. Introduce yourself to your nurse working next to you, your wingman. And most of all, if you feel like you're drowning or if you feel like you need help, don't hesitate to ask somebody. Please rate this video, and if you've had any experience with floating, leave a comment below, because I'd like to hear about it. If you like this video, share it with your friends. In fact, share it with your friends even if you think it sucks. Hit the subscribe button up there and join us as a passenger on the Keep It Real RN Express. And until next time, keep it real.